Perfect. Well, again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Um, as I was saying, the team from JBW have really done a great job in putting together our presentation that's going to be all around ISO 20000 service management and ITIL and the conundrum that sometimes faces businesses. And Robert, our presenter, he'll go into a lot of detail um, in his presentation today, but I will hand things over to Brock and he will make the introductions. Brock, take it away.
Thanks, Peter. Welcome, everybody. I don't know where everybody sits, but I'm here in the Minneapolis metro area. And it's a beautiful day out right now. I'm looking out the window and it's bright and sunshiny, and we got nice crisp white snow. So it's a great day to have a talk about ISO service management. I wanted to start by just giving PETA and our friends over at TechStack and also those from our colleagues at JBW Group a big thank you. It takes a lot of effort, collaboration, and work to put together a webinar like this, and just really appreciate everyone that's involved in delivering this content today. So if you'd allow me just a couple minutes, I just wanted to give you a little background on JBW Group International before we get started. JBW Group International was originally brought to life back in 2002 with the goal of helping organizations prepare for becoming ISO 27001 certified. While I can't claim to be the first owner of JBW Group International, I did take over as owner and CEO of June of last year, and really just looking forward to working with our current partners and hopefully many of you on this call for many years to come. Would love an opportunity to work with you to help your organizations achieve your ISO certification. JBW Group International, we're well positioned in the ISO community as one of the leading providers and a full service consultancy, as well as providing second party internal audit services. And what we do is we really just partner with you and your organizations to achieve ISO 27001, 27701, 28,000, of course, 20,000, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And I just do want to be clear on one point. While a lot of our auditors have worked with external registrars, JBW Group International does not do registration audits, but rather we work with large and small companies all across the world to help those companies prepare for their external audits. And we perform our audits just like a registrar would. Obviously, we have that capability and that knowledge. And because of that, we work with you to kind of close up any gaps and be a true consulting partner. And so far to date, we've achieved 100% pass rate, and that's just due to our significant experience and very talented auditors that we have at JBW. We not only just work with ISO, as previously mentioned, but we also cover PCI, CIS, CMMC, and also NIST frameworks as well. So we cover pretty wide swath of most of the cybersecurity frameworks out there. One of our very seasoned professionals is Mr. Robert Aanerud. He is one of our most trusted colleagues here at JBW Group International and comes to us with over 5 decades of experience in information security, privacy, business continuity, and as well as worked heavily in the defense industrial security programs as well. I could probably spend easily the next hour talking about Robert and his qualifications and his experience, but I'm sure that you will be well versed in his experience as we get into the ISO 20000 webinar here. Robert has a lot of different experience with not only the frameworks that we work in, but a lot of the legal and regulatory frameworks such as HIPAA, GDPR, and just a wealth of knowledge in a host of other international laws and regulations as it pertains to cybersecurity. Robert also has worked and performed several registration audits and has worked with many of the registration bodies and technical committees, including the CMMC accreditation body, or I believe they call themselves the Cyber AB now. And so I'm, doing you guys a huge disservice by taking up all the airtime from Robert. He's got a great program today. He's going to walk you through all the ins and outs of ISO 20000. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you guys all to Mr. Robert Aanerud. Robert, you have the con.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yeah, I could talk for about 5 minutes on my experiences and whatnot. I can't remember most of them. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk primarily about ITIL and ISO 20000, a little bit about CMMC, a little bit about some other control sets or requirements or guidelines or technical requirements, standards and whatnot. The most important thing I've noticed in many organizations over the years that I've consulted with, I've done certification audits with and whatnot, there's confusion or a conundrum when it comes to what model should they use for establishing an IT service management program. ITIL v4, of course, which is the most current model, they have v5 coming up soon, is a framework. It's actually a set of practices, a code of practice, and a customer focus organization. It deals mostly with IT service management policies and processes and with IT asset management. So it's focused very heavily on IT within an organization. ISO 20000 is an international standard, whereas ITIL is a set of guidelines, a set of practices, and a framework. ISO 20000 is all of those things, plus it's an international standard. The International Organization of Standards has put that out there. It's been out for a number of years now. The latest version is 2018. And that is a standard, an international industry standard that can be, the organization can get certified to. Next slide, please. So again, looking at ITIL versus ISO 20000, again, many organizations believe that by implementing ITIL, that they will have a complete complementary service system, IT service management system. However, it's guidance. It's not an industry standard, and it results in individual certification to different aspects or practices or in accordance with the books within ITIL 4. The various best practices that they recommend. Again, an individual can get certified, but not an organization. From the 20000 standpoint, that's an international standard. It's been in place for, I think, about 30 years now, and maybe when it comes to previous iterations of it, which were part of BSI and whatnot. And it's for service management. An organization can be assessed and certified that it meets the standard requirements, and that certification is done by an independent third-party certification audit organization, such as BSI, SRI, others. There are a number of them in the world, and they all promote and can certify to these standards. Now, the requirements within 20000 and the requirements within ITIL are actually fairly complementary when it comes to what they look at, what they go through, and whatnot. The biggest difference is ITIL is focused on IT. ISO 20000 is focused on the organization and process inputs and outputs from other areas of the organization. And an individual, as I said, can attend courses and get certified to, for instance, change management, or to demand management, or to other aspects of the ITIL books. 20000 is an overview of all of those things. And the aspects of that say that you've identified an IT service management system that is a fit for your customers, that is in line with the international standard, and you can meld in the best practices from ITIL 4. ISO standards, this is an important consideration, are not technical standards. So for instance, ITIL v4 provides more technical insight. Also, the use of tools within an organization, the particular processes, contractual requirements, and customer requirements may require certain levels of assurance in a tool, such as an encryption algorithm. So there are differences, but they're very complementary. Next, please. So they both provide guidance on life cycle. For instance, the Deming cycle, plan, do, check, act type of activities. Planning, design, transition, delivery, improvement of services, and that is specifically called out in ISO 20000 in that, in ITIL v4 as a progress for implementing the service and whatnot. ISO 20000 also provides that, and the alignments are very well coordinated, detailed, inclusive. 20,000, again, is not a technical standard, as are none of the ISO standards. They specify an underlying framework, and that is what's called a management system framework. That framework has been in existence since the late 1800s. It's more than just IT. It specifies what to do, and the organization decides how to meet the requirements. Those requirements, again, can partially be satisfied by looking at ITIL as far as particular technical aspects of different processes and activities. The organization decides how to meet the requirements. So neither ITIL nor 20,000 tells you what to do or how to do it. They say these are the things that you must meet in order to be conformant with the standard and with your framework of choice, and to be effective in your application of IT service management. So from that standpoint, again, ISO 20000, as is ITIL, can be applied to organization of any size, large and small, public and commercial, government activities, things like that. Also, when you look at ITIL and ISO 20000, if you perform the appropriate context, scope, risk assessment requirements, we'll talk more about those later, you can achieve compliance, or you may achieve compliance or support compliance with all legal, regulatory, and customer requirements. That's an important consideration, which if you're doing just ITIL, many times those legal, regulatory, customer requirements, specifically things like that, are not necessarily considered to a large extent. Next slide, please. We want to talk about positive assurance. If you implement an IT service management system, you want to ensure that you have positive assurance. In other words, that you are meeting your customer requirements, that you are providing the very best from an industry standpoint, from your organizational maturity and capability standpoint, and from the customer requirement standpoint. A new version of the 20,000 series called 20,000-11 is something that came out again several years ago. However, it wasn't given a whole lot of marketing or business push. From the standpoint of that technical guidance, what it does, it was published in September 2021, and it provides proof or alignment or comparison of ISO 20000 and ITIL 4, and specifically how you can achieve better assurance that your IT service management system is meeting all your requirements, and also the standpoint that the conformity of these things. ITIL v4 is certainly complementary and acts in some ways as an alternative control set to what may be listed in ISO 20000. Again, there's direct complementary activities, processes between those two. And again, when you get 20,000, you add those common management system requirements. Next page, please. Those common requirements are very important from all the ISO standards. International Organization Standards put together what was called a high-level specification. And all of the ISO standards, at least all of the major important ones, are now aligned with that. That is based on a number of quality management principles, which actually began in about the 1500s when we talk about plague in Europe and whatnot. Customer focus. The first principle and the most important principle of quality management, which applies to 20,000 and all ISO standards, as I said, is customer focus. Identifying and focusing on the customer's needs, requirements, understanding their objectives, their timelines, their time frames, their response capabilities, everything associated with that. Much of that is included within contractual requirements, contracts, proposals, and whatnot. Many customers may additionally send out what I call the 10,000 questions of death when it comes to fulfillment of a particular set of requirements. By implementing ITIL version 4 or the newest version coming out next year, ITIL v5, complementary with an ISO 20000 certification, you can meet those requirements. We'll talk about that later. Leadership is important from a quality management principle standpoint. Top level management is what they call it, of the organization, not just the IT group, but the organization. The management, the upper level management, executive management, even board of directors have to have some insight, understanding in order to provide guidance, direction, leadership, governance, and we'll talk more about governance from a CMMC standpoint as well, throughout the entire process to ensure that everybody's on the same page. Engagement of people is another one. You can't ignore, for instance, if you implement ITIL v4, you may not incorporate considerations from human resources, from finance, from accounting, from contracts, from proposals, things like that, into your set of requirements, controls, what you monitor, how you go through a life cycle. And that's important to engage those people to achieve a common understanding and to have clear emphasis on objectives down to a process level, down to a personal level. A process approach is also something that ISO has always proposed. In the most recent versions from the high-level specification standpoint, when certification auditors from, again, a BSI, an SRI, a Bureau Veritas, TUV, a Det Norsk Veritas, whatever, when they come in and certify your organization to an ISO standard, they will audit using a process approach. They demand that you also, as the organization, identify processes, related activities, inputs and outputs from those processes to other processes within the organization. ITIL has a process approach identified and objectives as well. However, it is not a requirement for ITIL. And therefore, what happens is you don't have the inputs and outputs and the complementary interrelated process identification, which is, again, required by ISO. Continual improvement is in both. You, of course, want to continue to improve. You want to monitor and check and act on activities that have not met your objectives, that are not as effective or efficient as you would like them to be or that the customers demand. So continual improvement and documented evidence of continual improvement and service improvement plans, things like that is a requirement of ISO 20000. Objective evidence is also a big thing. When auditors come in, again, from a second party, such as JBW Group, or from a third-party certification body organization, such as BSI or whatever, the auditors, again, will follow a process approach, and they will require objective evidence that that approach has been taken, that there's documented evidence of the policies, the processes, the procedures, the objectives, how those objectives flow down, and the interrelationships between processes. And then there's relationship management. ITIL, again, covers some degree of relationship management when it comes to outsourcers and service level agreements with outsourced providers, things like that. ISO 20000 extends that to include relationship management internally from an operational level agreement between, for instance, IT and HR or proposals or contracts, and also external relationship management with customers, service level agreements, with providers, outsourced IT providers, Microsoft, Office 365, things like that, which are very common now. So that relationship management from a supply chain, upstream and downstream standpoint, is very important, again, from an ISO standpoint. Next, please. The management system principles, as I said, all ISO standards are based on those 7 or 8, depending on how you count them, quality management principles. All the major standards align with these principles through that high-level specification. So any ISO standard that has been updated within the past 10 years is updated to that high-level specification, has common requirements from a general management system requirement standpoint. The management systems, as I said, are audited against those principles, standard and organization-specific requirements, using process-based audits, looking for objective evidence of conformity and effectiveness of the management system and of the processes and activities that are performed by that system. The documented evidence, again, includes, as I mentioned, policies, procedures, processes. You must have policies. You must have procedures which identify how things can be done. The processes have to show the interrelationship between the various organizations, sub-organizations, units, business domains, whatever. Also, internal audits are a basic requirement of ISO 20000. ITIL mentions internal audits and auditing of IT again, but not outside of the IT organization. Management reviews, formal objective evidence, a charter, if possible, and coverage of certain topical areas from an internal audit and management system review. If you're talking about certification body auditors, normally for most organizations, there's a 3-year certification period. You have an initial audit, which consists of a stage 1 document review and then an implementation review, stage 2. And then you have surveillance audits, normally on a 12-month basis. It depends on the size, scope, complexity of the organization. And then you have management review requirements. Management reviews must be done at least once a year. In most instances, in most organizations, that's far too long from a standpoint of information communication with management. Most IT service management systems have, as you may know, change management meetings on a regular basis, maybe a daily meeting, operational meetings which are hierarchical, which feed up to upper level management. So again, management review and operational review are hierarchical in nature as well. Corrections and corrective actions. If you have a security incident, if you have an IT incident, if you have an app that is not behaving properly, if you have customers that forgot their passwords, then you have to have certain required documentation which says how you're going to treat that, how do you reissue a password, what kind of mechanism do you use for that purpose. A correction is something that is more like triage. A corrective action is a long-term plan which must include a timeline and whatnot to get at the root cause of an issue. These are important from a documentation standpoint, having the procedures, having the work instructions, association with the tools, and again, we'll talk about tools later, which are a very important part, emerging part of an IT service management system for all organizations at this point in time. Risk management, which includes risk assessment, risk treatment, updated risk, operational risk, risks and opportunities. When you talk about ITIL v4 and ISO 20000, ITIL looks at it from the standpoint of IT risk primarily. And if you look at organizations that have implemented ITIL and have an IT service management system, which may or may not be certified, many of them will identify, for instance, risks associated with demand management, okay? How do you meet customers' demands? What do you identify in order to determine what demands are in place? Emerging technologies and things like that. Both ITIL and ISO 20000 require a look at that risk. And again, 20000 requires that it be documented, that be done on a regular basis, that it be available in documented objective evidence, which includes processes, procedures, records, tickets, if you're using a ticketing system, things like that, to determine if you have performed that in accord with your objectives. Incident management, of course, is a big thing. Much of that leads to correction and corrective action, but incidents also might include the identification of an incident. If there are common incidents of that type, that could escalate to problem management activities. Problem management can be addressed in a number of ways. From an ITIL standpoint, again, it looks mostly at IT organization and IT incidents. ISO 20000 requires you look at incidents from a number of different views or standpoints. security incident management. There is a new amendment to ISO standards, all ISO standards, for instance, that now talks about the requirements for risk assessment, management, objectives, and opportunities associated with climate change. Now, I don't know if I don't know exactly how that came about, because you didn't find that kind of a communication from either International Accreditation Forum or ISO or any ABs regarding, for instance, COVID. When COVID came into place, they didn't put out an amendment to all management system standards on that, but they have now with climate change. So in a risk assessment from any ISO standard standpoint, you also have to look at the impacts, the context, in order of the organization, and the risk associated with climate change and all its variables in order to become certified. And then continuous improvement, which we talked about before. That is something that is included in all reasonable guidance, best practices, industry best practices, and standards. Next, please. So the positive assurance, what we want to do, if we put a service management presentation together or service management system together, from an organizational standpoint, if we're going to spend money, if we're going to put personnel in charge of these things, if we're going to, promote and communicate to customers what we are doing, you want to make sure that there's a basis in fact and good positive assurance that what you're doing is the right thing to do, that you're meeting the requirements, that you've looked at the risk, that you've implemented in accordance with standards. And by the way, if you're ISO 20000, you have a third-party certified organization, certified by accreditation bodies, certified by international standards organization, that your organization meets those requirements. That is positive assurance. When we look at Part 11, again, Part 11 of ISO 20000 and ITIL, that 20,000 Part 11 Clause 4 gives you an overview of ITIL and 20,000, what they can do, what they can't do, how they are complementary to each other, and how you can support the demonstration. That's important. You're trying to demonstrate the conformity of your IT service management system to your customers primarily. Clause 5 also talks about goes into the detail about ITIL v4 aspects and publications. Publications are associated with different process areas such as demand management, change management, things like that, which are within that foundation series. Next, please. So we're talking about correlation of that stuff. There are requirements and clause level comparisons in the practice guides, in Annex A of Part 11 and whatnot. ITIL basically says create, deliver, and support. So it's a subjugated modification of the PDCA activities. When we talk about ISO 20000, we talk about resources, competence, and knowledge. Very similar, different wording, same meaning. Clause 8, service management practices, identify with the practices, the books within the ITIL series and the aspects within ISO. And also Clause 9, monitoring and measurement. ITIL v4 requires monitoring and measurement, again, mostly of IT, not of things outside of IT. In order to achieve that positive assurance, you have to go beyond IT. The practice guides, which are, again, are part of the series of foundation documents, correlate, not word for word, but correlate very well, are aligned with service management practices in Clause 8, and also continual improvement. When you look at Part 11, Annex A, that's a term and definition thing. An objective is something that is not required in ISO 20000. They strongly recommend that you have objectives, but they do not require them. ISO 20000 and all ISO standards do require that objectives be defined, and that objectives are hierarchically supported by different organizations and departments within an organization. So again, this feeds the positive assurance. It identifies the fact that you're looking at it from an organizational life cycle standpoint, with processes that input into IT, that output from IT to report to management. And the outcomes then can be determined by management to be effective, conformant, by legal to be compliant, and by the ISO certification auditor to be conformant and effective with the requirements of not just the standard, but ITIL v4 in your own practices and customer activities and requirements. Next, please. When we talk about the clause comparison again, organization is defined as the same thing. From an organizational standpoint, you can have limited organization within the scope of a certification, but that still includes everything that supports the customer's focus, the fulfillment of requirements, the achievement of objectives. Service is defined a little bit differently. Delivering value. So 20,000 basically says facilitating outcomes that the customer wants to achieve. ITIL v4 defines it as a means of enabling value creation. So ITIL is based more on value, efficiency, and cost than ISO 20,000, which talks about customer achievement of requirements. ISO 20,000 is a service management system. ITIL is basically a service value system. So again, what we're seeing here is a focus on, from ITIL standpoint, on IT primarily, on efficiency and cost primarily. So you have a value system in place, services that achieve a certain level of value to the customer and to the organization from a cost, from a service level achievement standpoint. ITIL defines configuration and configuration items specifically. ISO 20,000 defines configuration item. As far as configuration management and activities, that is a process function within ISO 20,000, which is required. Let me also state that ITIL does not require that all the components of ITIL, all the books, all the aspects, all the principles within ITIL does not require that all of those be implemented. ISO 20,000 has no exclusions. You have to implement everything within ISO 20,000 in some way, manner, shape, or form. For a particular organization, especially if you're using third-party outsourced IT providers, like, again, Microsoft, Google, Microsoft Azure, Google, whatever, then there's a certain shared responsibility, which is recognized within 20,000. It is not recognized within ITIL. Next, please. Correlation of those clauses again. We're talking about relationships. There's some tables in both ITIL 20,000 and ITIL. They have been revised to a certain extent in the latest version. They're going to be revised again in ITIL v5. And the next version or amendment to 20,000 is going to talk a little bit more about other things. Problem management, for instance, is mapped in ITIL v4 Foundation Book 5.2. Service management practices. That discusses problem management, escalation of incidents to problems, problem management control, knowledge-based things like that. That is not specifically identified in 20,000. However, problem management, service management practices, and your requirement for determining those through documentation, through processes and procedures that must be documented meeting your customer requirements is important. Stakeholder value is included within the customer service, customer focus requirements and principles of 20,000. Stakeholder value is actually under 8.2 service interactions. Create, deliver, and support. When we talk about ITIL, that's a model for value streams. Again, value streams in problem management, just as one perspective, but those value streams have to be looked at from every standpoint. And then there are practice guides again for problem management when we talk about the 4 ITIL dimensions. Next, please. So there is a direct correlation between most ITIL v4 books, aspects, and determinants and sections, and 20,000, especially 2018. One place where you might not see a direct connection is for managing innovation and emerging technologies. That is covered in ITIL v4 digital and IT strategy documentation and books. However, in ITIL v4, you also have direct plan and improve. And in ISO 20000, you've got a correlation between all of those things, between digital IT strategy from a service improvement plan standpoint, from a continuous improvement standpoint, and also direct plan and improve strategy in all of the various clauses that are mapped in the beneath thing. Leadership. Leadership has to understand. They have to know what the digital and IT strategies are in order to determine budget, make directional calls, provide guidance. Policies must incorporate scope and context, and policies must incorporate digital and IT strategy. What's your service improvement plan? You may have emerging technologies that you're looking at, such as the use of new tools. We'll talk about that later. Risk and opportunities, objectives, all of the other things that you see here. So they are directly related between ITIL and 20000. ITIL says this is what you should do. 20000 says this is what you must do in order to become certified. Next, please. So when we talk about IT service management, scope and objectives, again, ITIL does not require a specific scope or particular objectives. However, when you talk about IT service management, you really should, ITIL v4 says you should consider key objectives in these areas. And guess what? That aligns very well with ISO 20000. Customer satisfaction. Understand what those requirements are, determine what the requirements are, document them, ensure that you are focusing on those, ensure that your level of assurance for particular things like password retention, business continuity recovery planning, things like that, meet your customers' expectations as well as requirements. Efficient service delivery. Again, ITIL is most concerned with cost effectiveness and uptime. ISO 20000 is considers more than just efficiency, but effectiveness in that service delivery. Incident resolution, problem prevention, change management, we talked about those things as well. Changes, of course, from an ITIL standpoint and from an ISO 20000 standpoint, must be controlled, must be documented, must be approved if necessary. Again, depends on your customer requirements, your organizational requirements and objectives, and what kind of disruption to service particular change may cause. A failed change, as many of you know, when you talk about an SEV1 incident, can affect multiple customers, can bring systems down. Even CISA understands that now with the breach that was identified a few weeks ago. Next, please. Continuous improvement, risk management, alignment with the objectives. Again, aligning from a top level down through various organizations within the company, as well as external to the company. That relationship management, internal and objectives. Understanding that objectives, you may have a high level objectives established at a high level policy organizational level or at an IT level. And then hierarchically, you may have objectives which are established dealing with a particular component of that. We got questions and answers. Let me see. Let's talk about Q&A. We got two questions. Would someone like to speak up on that?
Yes, so we've got a first question that came in from Chris. Thank you, Chris. He says, I understand the need for the management system from an overall security and risk management perspective. What value does an ISO 20000 certification provide from a customer perspective when added to other certifications like ISO 27001 and PCI?
Exactly. Good question. When we talk about ISO 20000 certification, again, in conjunction with other standards, for instance, now, Chris, what is Chris's role or title or responsibility? So I can address that specifically to that.
I do not know. Chris, would you mind sharing that with us?
Generally, I manage compliance for
Okay.
for an organization.
Okay, great. When you talk about compliance, you're talking about the understanding of legal, regulatory, contractual requirements, customer requirements, service level requirements, et cetera, et cetera. An ISO 20000 system, again, will focus on not only, again, IT requirements, satisfaction of those, but for instance, payments, billings, demand management. When you talk about the association inter-process relationships, you may have proposals and contracts, which get an amendment to the contract. The customer wants greater control over, for instance, let's use encryption as a standard, a higher level of encryption, or two-factor authentication, or something like that, which might be put into place, which is not required necessarily by 20,000 or ITIL. Then you talk about interaction. You mentioned interaction with other ISO standards. There's a formal methodology for integration of different ISO standards. 20,000-1 and 27,001, latest version as well as the previous version, 2013, are very highly supportive, complementary. And for instance, within 20,000, as you may know, there is a requirement for security management. If you have an integrated system, which includes also certification of 27,001, that is further description and demonstration and evidence that security management is being performed specifically to 27,001 and or other related control set standards. For instance, if you do 20,000, if you do 27,001, if you have a requirement for CMMC level 1, 27,000 includes, which 20,000 does not, a requirement for looking at other customer requirements, expectations, legal regulatory requirements, and whatnot regarding, for instance, CMMC level 1 requirements, which are based on SB 800-171. So you can prove that you are meeting very detailed levels of requirements, either defined by legal, regulatory, contractual, defined by your customer, or industry best practice, and that there's objective evidence supporting that. It's a demonstration of your ability to be compliant. Now, ISO auditors, third-party certification auditors, do not interpret legal requirements and do not determine if it is compliant with the legal or regulatory requirement. What they do is they identify the conformity to the identified requirements and the effectiveness of those requirements in meeting those objectives. So you've got a very strong demonstration. If you do 20,000 by itself, security management necessarily is, and compliance is not necessarily a large consideration for analysis, risk analysis, things like that. If you add 27,001, it's more detailed, it's more specific, it includes requirements for determining additional control sets, which might be required by law. For instance, under HIPAA, risk assessment, under GDPR, privacy assessment. If you add 28,000 certification to the 20,000 to 27,000 and your overall integrated service management system or integrated management system, then you are also assured of meeting conformance and effectiveness of GDPR requirements for privacy information management systems. So again, it's demonstrating how far do you want to go? What level of conformity or assurance do you need? You get more positive assurance out of an integrated management system than you do from a single system. Also, from a certification body standpoint, you have certain cost savings from an integration standpoint, commonality savings, common practices, things like that. And again, all through the life cycle, you have determination that you are demonstrating conformity and effectiveness, which helps you achieve compliance. Does that satisfy your question? Chris?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, no problem. And we have other questions as well. Let's take another question.
I'm sorry about that. I was on mute. We've got
Okay.
a question from John. If I already have an operating ISMS, can you talk a little bit about integrating ISO 20000 and ISO 27001?
Sure. That could take a long time to describe, but 27001 obviously is an extension of the security management criteria in 20000. If you have an ISO 27001 certification, then that by definition meets the requirement of security management within ISO 20000. That shows that you've gone to a greater extent to achieve conformity with customer requirements. You've gone through the entire process of evaluating risks and opportunities, looking at customer legal regulatory requirements, looking at additional control sets that might be required, whether it's HIPAA, whether it's GDPR, whether it's California Privacy Act, whether it's state breach and disclosure acts, no matter what it is. So again, gives you other assurance. Moving into 20000, again, even 27000 and 20000 have a number of different contact points. 27000 requires control of changes. 20000 expands upon that and saying changes must be controlled using a particular configuration management database, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So does that satisfy your question, John? John's just harassing me.
All right. We did have one more question, if we could take that before we move on, Robert.
Of course.
Mark is asking, is there an estimate for when ITIL version 5 is likely to be released?
ITIL version 5, they have not set a release date for that yet. I kind of heard that it may be coming out next year, but there's still, the committees and whatnot that are involved with this, and the ITIL Foundation approval of those changes has not been achieved yet. So I don't know. Is that it for questions?
Yep, that's it for now.
I actually have one for you, Robert.
All righty.
If we think about the context of ISO 20000 in, let's say, just a standard corporation, how would that map over and work with managed services providers that might work with many different organizations and run help desk for many different disparate entities?
Mm-hmm. There's a requirement in all ISO standards for determining scope and context. That means determining who you are, what you do, where you do it from, who you do it for, what tools and services you used. Outsourced services, again, the use of Azure or Google or whatnot. There's a concept within 2000 called shared services. So you identify and you must look at the scope, the context, what's the nature of those shared services, what portion of those services are provided by the outsourcer, and most important, from an ISO standpoint, you have to objectively establish governance over those outsourced services.
Okay, I'm going to expand on that actually a little bit. What if it's on the other side? What if you're looking at, what if you are an MSP looking at 20000 and potentially using that for sales and marketing purposes? Is that something that's prevalent in the industry?
Oh, of course. All the major IT services providers. Again, I worked with Ernst & Young Certify Point to initially certify Microsoft Azure, Google, and other CDW and other major organizations for that purpose. All of the major IT outsourcers, cloud service providers, MSPs, are certified to multiple standards. They have to be. And they are all working up towards CMMC and the other requirements as well. They cannot ignore a major set of requirements. So they're really obligated to do that. If you're an MSP or if you're an outsourced service provider that does not do that or support that, then you could be, for instance, excluded from partnership under Microsoft or Cisco because of that. So it's pretty important. Does that satisfy your question?
It does. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you. Okay. So we talked about, again, we're talking about scope and objectives, continuous improvement, efficient use of resources. Again, ITIL primarily is focused on efficiency and service value. ISO 20000 goes beyond that. Next, please. We're going to talk a little bit about CMMC. I know that a number of you, CISOs, compliance personnel, things like that, are somewhat involved with CMMC, have been following what they're doing and things like that. Cybersecurity security model is a program which is developed by the U.S. Department of Defense, and its aim is to enhance cybersecurity practices within what's called the Defense Industrial Base, the DIB, to safeguard critical, unclassified, confidential, or critical information, such as federal contract information, how a contract is specified, what requirements are in contract, things like that, and other associated types of information. CMMC has had kind of a rocky start. Current status of the program is the proposed rule came out in December of 2023. And again, this cannot be, CMMC cannot be implemented as a requirement for Defense Industrial Base until the final rule is established and published in the Federal Registrar. That has not been done yet. The public comment period for the proposed rule has been extended due to some issues associated with the cyber AB. Once the DoD responds to public comments and issues a final rule, the CMCC program will go into effect and be incorporated in contracts, hopefully starting in first quarter of 2025. Changes have been made recently in the CMMC model, simplifying the model from five levels to 3, allowing self-attestation to level 1, which is extremely important from what we're talking about. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Aligning CMMC requirements more closely with SB 800-171, which is a NIST special publication, and that is a derivation of the actual requirements. The DoD intends to publish a comprehensive cost analysis associated with each level of CMMC 2.0 as a part of the rulemaking. Again, they're concerned, and a lot of the concern has been in the upper level committees about this, from the standpoint of costs for small organizations. You want to minimize the cost, and that's what they're fighting with right now. CMMC, ITIL v4, and ISO 20000, as well as ISO 27001, all support this common objective to enhance cybersecurity under DIB. In most cases, Defense Industrial Security Program activities are covered under it. However, from a commercial standpoint, it makes sense as well. Next slide, please. ISO 20000, again, we talked about comparison. When you got CMMC added to it, you're talking about service performance, you're talking about formal certification. And again, you can use, even at this point in time, and we have a number of personnel within JBW that are experts in this, NIST SB 800-171 requirements as a third control set for implementation of 27001 that will be accepted for self-attest or for formal certification to level 1 of CMMC. Next, please. Again, CMMC is specific to government contractors. However, there's a lot of good information that is going to be coming out from that. We talked about the focus of ITIL and 20000, and again, they are very complementary and support CMMC. Next, please. Capability and maturity models. This is something that, again, if you look at NIST publications, this has been a criteria for a number of years now, and in satisfaction of CMMC, you have to look at these things, both ITIL and V4 and 20000 in combination with NIST 800-171 will help satisfy these. Next, please. Next, please. Same kinds of things, security and compliance. I know many of you are CISOs, are compliance specialists, not just IT. The maturity of cybersecurity practices is obviously from a best practice standpoint, from an industry specification standpoint, from realization from the risk associated with breaches and whatnot. Recently, security and compliance are very important. But all of these other things, metrics, reporting, and whatnot, support that. Next. There are also tools. When we talk about the implementation of a system, IT service management system, service management tools are available which will help you significantly in efficiently and effectively managing and providing objective evidence for IT service management in meeting objectives. And that includes things like ServiceNow, which I know many of our clients have either gone to or are going to. ServiceNow, in particular, is a decision-making framework. It includes strategy, portfolio, and technical decisions. It recommends a governance model and can help establish it with the governance module, specializing in strategy, portfolio, technical, other good governance, streamlining and whatnot. It can significantly help you. If you've used tools in the past like Jira or SolarWinds or things like that, it goes beyond what is particularly a ticket management system. So ServiceNow is an excellent, comprehensive governance model, and actually tools support the certification for an ISO 20000 system, as well as ITV4. There are other tools, obviously Jira, SolarWinds, Zendesk, Topdesk, there are hundreds of them. The choice of tools depends on the organization's needs, the industry requirements, the scale of operations, scope, context, things like that. And those have to be evaluated during a risk assessment. If you are looking at new use of tools, you need to do a emerging technology detailed risk assessment of the value of those tools and meeting objectives and requirements. Next, please. And JBW Group can help you in helping select those tools, looking at those tools, modules, and comparisons that can be used. The bottom line is, when you do this, if you look at solving that conundrum by looking at ITIL v4, ISO 20000, maybe ISO 27001 if you got additional security requirements and constraints, compliance requirements for privacy, things like that, you want to be able to achieve and to demonstrate the conformity and the effectiveness, also the efficiency from a cost-effective standpoint. Of course, this is going to help that, of your IT service management system. By doing that, you're looking at best practices, you're looking at international standards, you're looking at third-party certification by an accredited body that you are meeting conformity and effectiveness requirements for that. And call Brock if you have any problems. Next, please. Any other final questions or considerations? Again, this has been a short thing that we covered a lot of different topics. We can provide other assistance, determination, assessments, pre-assessments for any considerations you might have regarding this. Brock?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I really appreciate you putting this together today. Great presentation, and I know we're at time, a little over actually, so I'll keep it short and sweet. As Robert mentioned, feel free to reach out to me at any time if you have any questions. If you want to, talk deeper on any of these subjects that were brought up today, we're more than happy to help, and I'm happy to jump on a call and chat. So I thank everybody for joining today, and I'll try to get you off and onto your day jobs.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your participation. And thank you to the rest of the panel as well.